The Canadian government plans to subsidize media companies, and the Ontario Liberals look to introduce a soda tax. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. Today we'll start with some news about Canadian media companies. Funny enough, you could consider them my competition as we strive to fight for your listening time. So, the federal government has announced a fund of over $600 million. It's being designated to operate as subsidies for media companies. The minister who is responsible for overseeing the distribution of the money, his name is Pablo Rodriguez, and he promises that the process will be fully transparent. Well, that's great, because if there's one thing that governments are known for, it's transparency. Wink, wink. So, the Liberal government based their action on a supposed need to save the media industry. In the last decade, the news companies have been shrinking as operations close down and jobs are cut. It really feels like traditional media is dying, and it has been on the decline for quite some time now. I'm just going to jump right ahead and pose an idea here. Maybe the industry isn't meant to be saved. Maybe it's on its deathbed for a reason, because it has failed to transition. It's not like people are not seeking out news nowadays. They still are. I don't really think people are less interested in hearing about current events than they were, say, 50 years ago. Maybe it's quite the opposite, you could argue. Young people are getting more and more involved because of things like the environment, and people want to know about politics and government. So, if you funnel your money to save an ineffective market, well, you better prepare to last for the long haul. It's not like the government is bridging a gap with this kind of funding here. The companies don't just need a little bit of a boost to become relevant again. This is the definition of a band-aid solution. Instead, the companies should be looking to fund innovation and invest in current methods of media consumption. Love it or hate it, social media is playing a big part, and other mediums like podcasts are on the rise. People go on Twitter, they'll see a blue check mark, or they'll look for lots of retweets, lots of likes, and that's where they want to get their news from. They like podcasts because they're available, and they can listen on their own time. Newspapers are boring. People don't want to tune into TV anymore because that's dead. It's all about Netflix. So, how about get a Netflix show going? How about a YouTube channel? How about make your social media more interesting? Some of these companies have done that, but a lot of them are left in the dust, and they're begging for money so they can be bailed out. Well, it's a short-term bailout. Once the money dries up, you're back in the exact same situation as before. So anyways, back to the article. Rodriguez is gathering a panel of experts to help him decide which organizations deserve the funding. One of the groups that were chosen to share their input was Unifor, and this caused a lot of controversy. The panel is going to have direct sway on the outcome of the funding. If you want a level playing field and don't want any bias to seep into the media, I would assume you'd select a non-partisan representative. Well, nope, not in this case. Unifor is a massive union that covers people from the auto industry to communications and even to energy. Conservative governments and unions don't typically mix. They have quite bad blood, and recently you can see that evidently if you want to look at Doug Ford, for example. His cuts to teaching are now well received by unions because unions have the opposite mentality. Conservatives typically want to save money, reduce spending, and make the budgets go positive. While the unions, they want more spending, they want their constituents to earn more, they want more benefits, such like that. And as you can see, they are opposing viewpoints. So typically, unions don't like having conservative governments in power. They want liberals or NDP members who are down with spending obscene amounts of money. Unifor is no example to this, as they themselves, as I mentioned, are a union, and they have a major bias towards not liking conservatives. They publicly denounce their agendas, and they actually labeled themselves Andrew Scheer's worst nightmare. If you have a group like that on your panel, you can kind of already tell where their intentions are, and you might know which forms of media they're going to support and which ones they're going to vote against when it comes to funding. The federal government invited one of the most anti-conservative groups around to help them decide which media companies get a piece of the $600 million pie. That's really an issue because the Liberal Party already has incentives on their own to favor channels that support them. Now you have panel members who are also on the same page. It's a recipe for disaster. They can stack the cards in their favor massively. The approach should be to fund these channels fairly. That includes conservative media and liberal leaning channels, or you don't fund them at all, which I think is the preferable solution, but because it already seems like they're going forward with some type of funding, you might as well do it evenly. You better have an anti-liberal group on par with Unifor, or else things are never going to balance. The potential to increase liberal coverage and stifle conservative talking figures exist, and unfortunately, it seems quite likely. That's not good for political discussion at all, and it serves as a form of echo chamber. Even if you dislike what the opposition says, you can't develop your own opinions if you are never challenged. You can go your whole life thinking something, but it's going to be very shallow, not well thought through, and very, very weak unless you put it through the grinder. You need to talk to people, you need to have discussions, you need to hear other opinions so you can better develop your own. Without that, you are doomed in politics and you can't lead a nation. It's very close-minded, and it's not the approach you want to have. You need both of these opposing forces to have a healthy government, and without one or the other, you fall into a pseudo-authoritarian regime. All you hear is one narrative, and that's it to you. Nobody can replace it, so you end up with a one-track mind system. This also has me thinking of the government using it as a means to get favors. They really have control ultimately over who gets funded. If you want to increase your odds of receiving some money, well, maybe you cozy up to them. Or maybe you try to impress their panel members, like Unifor. Maybe you shift your narrative to be slightly in favor of Trudeau, or more in favor of unions. The minister who organized this group continues to say he wanted a balanced team, but I really don't see that unless you have a party to balance the radicalization of Unifor, which they don't have, even if everyone else on the party is centrist. Having Unifor in the equation makes things balanced towards the left. That isn't what is meant by a balanced group. It's not possible to have that where one radicalized party spewing their opinion and there's nobody of the opposing force to fight back against it. It's not fair, and it's obvious to me that that's by design. It was not meant to be practical and bias-free from the very beginning. Otherwise, these parties wouldn't be a part of the equation at all. To me, it sounds like one potential side effect of all of this trouble is worsening people's mistrust in popular media. You have the government sticking their fingers into what is supposed to be a largely independent sector. People may begin to question whose interests are being placed on top of whose. Is it the people's or the politicians? Even if there is no manipulation in this, and that's a big if, it's still going to be at the back of people's minds. Heading in towards the election, if you see any ad campaigns that are heavily in favor of Trudeau, you're going to be wondering now, is that a byproduct of this $600 million funding that's being dangled over everyone's head? And here's the thing with our government system. It's also an incentive to keep the current government in power. The Liberals have promised to give this subsidy to media companies. Media companies have massive reach and they influence a lot of what you see. A lot of people get their news from them and they base their votes on that kind of stuff. So, let's say that the Liberals do lose. It's very unlikely that the Conservative government will continue with the subsidy. It's likely to get chopped. So, now you give these guys an incentive to give you a favor. It gives them an incentive to cover you in a better light because money is dangled on top of it now. And I asked a question. What is the difference between that and buying votes? If you think about it from a pessimistic viewpoint and how things can go wrong, it seems like the Liberals might have a sly reason to be doing this right now. As I have outlined before, I'm not even quite sure these subsidies need to happen. I don't think it's the government's place to be putting money in the hands of media like that. The main excuse that the industry is dying, and if they don't come in and save the day like knights on their white horses, then we're going to have no media. But I find that to be very far from the truth, as I mentioned before. It seems to me like the companies have just not transitioned properly. It's like a Blockbuster situation. People don't want to be renting your DVDs when they have Netflix. People don't want to be reading your newspapers when they can get their news from Twitter. Now, maybe or maybe not that's the right approach, but it's what's happening today, and that's where you have to be heading, to the digital realm. I would have liked to have seen the money go towards proper funding and investment in new technologies and new plans for these companies to adapt, but that wasn't the case. So, the decision of this panel is set to be released once they reach a consensus, so we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. If the scales are tipped in favor of the left, that will be an issue. A healthy mix of both sides, the left and the right, that's really the ultimate goal to have here, and without that, it's going to be a very, very negative situation that will affect us long term. The panel is going to publicly release all the names of the companies that they do decide to fund, So once that is out, I'll have to go through it and make sure everything checks out. Until then, we just have to wait. So moving on to our next story now. This also has to do with the Liberals, but this time I think it's a good idea and I'm going to give them kudos for it. So, Ontario Liberal MPs want to introduce a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages. The common term for that is the soda tax. Now, this is not high on their priority list. It actually ranks 18th out of 19 initiatives, so it's quite near the bottom. But it is still quite interesting nevertheless, and certain MPs are more vocal about it than others. The proposal is to introduce a 20% tax calculated using an average price of $2.50 per liter of soda. Then, they will take the tax revenue and put it towards something like creating a national healthy lunch program for schools. The tax is supposed to push consumers away from purchasing overly sugary drinks, as the prices for them will exceed more healthy options. Water comes to mind, or maybe even vegetable juice. What happened to V8? Ew, right? But still, a little bit better for you, a little better for the healthcare system, and you're making a productive use of the tax revenue, going towards supporting healthy lifestyles. Now that sounds pretty good to me. I think it's a good idea, especially because of this obesity epidemic that is sweeping through North America. One major contributor to that problem is these calorie-dense beverages. They are jam-packed with sugars, and they're terrible for your health. They are readily available and inexpensive, plus people like them. Those factors right there in combination create a playing field where these drinks are being overconsumed to the detriment of not only the individual, but society at large. The University of Waterloo actually did some research on this, and the findings are quite shocking. One item that they discovered was a projection that put the death toll of sugary drinks to be at over 63,000 people over the next 25 years. Now, that's not really to say that these drinks are poisonous and drinking it will directly kill you. It's the health complications that come as a byproduct of consuming these drinks. On top of that, the Canadian healthcare system will need to spend over $50 billion in the next 25 years to remedy all of the health issues that stem from just soda. To put things into perspective, this proposed soda tax is estimated to pull in $29.6 billion in that same time span. And as a side effect of the tax, it is also projected that we are going to shave $37 billion from that healthcare expense. Like with all taxes, having this number go down is quite desired because a lower revenue would mean reduced consumption, which is the goal here. I'm not quite sure there's really a tax you want to see go up. Having it go down like in all other times is positive in this case. If the tax pulled in $0 annually, well, that would be a good thing because it means we reached a perfect situation. Now, you can look at that and say it's unlikely, but that's the goal we're heading to. That's a direction. Reducing the amount of consumption, and that comes as a byproduct of a lower tax. If you take in more revenue, well, it's a bad thing because it means people are drinking so much of these drinks, but at the same time, you have more money to combat that. Launching these healthy lunch initiatives at schools is a great way to do it. Educating people on the negative effects of soda is a good thing. And here's one thing to take into consideration. We are combating a billion-dollar marketing industry. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, all these snack companies, they pour in money by the fistful into advertising and making you believe that you want these drinks. You see them everywhere. It's on TV, it's on social media. It has this connotation of being refreshing, Sprite. All of that nonsense, it's not true. The truth is, they're terrible for you. And on top of that, I covered a story recently where it was found that Coca-Cola actually had the power to destroy research documents that they did not like. How did that come about? Well, they would fund these researchers at universities, they would pour money into it, and as a result, in the contracts, they would put a clause in, and it would say, whatever the findings are, before they are released, Coca-Cola would have an opportunity to review it, and if they did not like the results, they would destroy the paper, no questions asked, because they were the funders. That was their right according to the contract. All that shady scientific stuff, on top of the fact that they have so much money to make you, I guess you could say, want their drink through advertisements, it's been a real negative thing that's affected a lot of people's lifestyles. Typically, I'm not really in favor of government intervention, but in this case, it's not an ideal battle. The corporations are putting massive pressure on the consumers, and if they had it their way, all you would drink is soda, there wouldn't be anything else, but obviously we can't have that. So there has to be government pressures to help combat that issue, because if not from them, who else will take up the fight? The Conservative Party took this moment as an opportunity to bring up the fact that there are too many taxes on Canadians though. They state that this is similar to the carbon tax, and it's not going to curb consumption. Instead, it's only going to hurt poor people. Now, I only half agree with that notion. I don't think it's entirely true. The carbon tax was problematic because people needed to drive. Rich or poor, we have to go places, and commuting isn't possible in many locations throughout Canada. As a result, many families needed to bite down and just foot the extra expense without changing their habits. With soda, it has different parameters. People do have widely available alternatives. You don't need soda. It's not essential. It is in fact 100% a luxury. You can easily swap it out with water. Problem solved. Maybe not as tasty, but way better for you. What they have in common though, the soda tax and the carbon tax, is the scope of effect. The carbon tax screwed over lower income families because it was harder for them to foot the bill even with a rebate. The charges come now, the rebate comes later. It puts them in a negative situation at the moment. The soda tax will work in the same manner, where an extra 25 cents might deal a blow to lower income households, but will it really bother middle and high earners? The Liberal MPs may have been ambitious with their estimates due to this factor here. The stakes aren't really that high for people who make a fair amount of income, and it's foreseeable that those consumers, they might just ignore the tax altogether. In this case, you get the benefit of tax revenue, but without the change in consumer habits. And that's where the similarity lies in the carbon tax, as well as the fact that lower income people are more susceptible. But in this case, it's not an essential. It's just soda. It's not that important. So it's perfectly fine in my opinion. And there's also this notion of people wanting to make their own choices and they shouldn't be controlled by the government. Well, I'd counter that by saying your freedom is not being taken away here. You're just being taxed proportional to the impact the healthcare system has to endure from bad decision making. This is not a no-cost action, especially when extrapolated over the long term. Consuming soda in obscene amounts has obvious effects that hurt not only you, but society. Obesity and poor eating habits wreak havoc on the healthcare system, as you've seen from the estimates from the University of Waterloo. Over $50 billion in the span of 25 years. If drinking soda is known to contribute largely to that epidemic, I don't think putting a tax on it is the worst idea. Hypothetically, poor habits stem from more than just soda consumption, but in some cases, that alone is enough to take you down a downward spiral. If you develop a condition from consumption of sugary drinks, this tax will help remedy that issue instead of passing it on to the general taxpayer. Although not entirely in the same group, cigarettes are a closer comparison to soda than something like water. I don't have much issue with this policy, and I think it has the potential, if refined a little bit, to really help curb a major issue affecting Canada today. It's really an initiative I would like to see blossom because there is an issue here and we have to tackle it. At the very least, this gets the conversation going, and that itself is a good thing. So, that's enough for today. Thanks for joining me on the Perri platform. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and follow me on Twitter at Perri Platform. I'll see you soon.